Welcome to the exhibit Civics in Action at the State Historical Museum of Iowa. As you enter the exhibit, there are several panels on the wall that read, Civics in Action: What is an active and engaged citizen? Civic learners seek to understand our federal and state government and find ways to play an active role. Look for inspiration as you discover stories of Iowans who have helped shape our state and nation. As you explore this exhibit, here are some questions for consideration. How has the idea of liberty and equality changed in Iowa and the United States? How can the U.S. Constitution and Iowa Constitution be changed? On that panel, there are pictures of Edna Griffin from Polk County, military service and community advocate, and also Mary Beth Tinker and John Tinker, also of Polk County, free speech advocates, image from the Associated Press. The next panel reads, What are the branches of government and how do their roles differ? How do laws and social structures change? The images on that panel are Maria Running Moccasins Pearson from Cass County, Story County, American Indian advocate, and on the bottom is Mia Peterson of Webster County and Polk County, disability rights advocate, image from Amy Doring Photography. The next panel reads, How can you be a civic learner, participant, and leader in our constitutional democracy? How can you serve your community, state, and nation? The images on that panel are of James B. Weaver from Davis County, soldier and elected official, and Jonas Powashik, Tama County, Polk County, soldier, elder, and public servant. In the display case are several artifacts and accompanying information. One label reads, Civics in Action. The three branches of government in Iowa and the United States are the executive, judicial, and legislative. Then Governor Branstad signed the bill with his pen to help fund the State Historical Building. The gavel was used by Judge Gifford S. Robinson, Justice of the Iowa Supreme Court from 1888 to 1899, serving 3 years as Chief Justice of Iowa. On display are two artifacts, pen used by Governor Terry Branstad, 1983, and gavel used by Chief Justice G.S. Robinson, about 1890. Another label reads, People in Iowa and the United States take action through many activities. Edith Tinkham wrote a letter to Governor William Harding in 1920 protesting people speaking German in her neighborhood in the northwest Iowa town of Sutherland. People across the United States marched to support the U.S. efforts in Operation Desert Storm in August 1990 through February 1991. Iowans have long debated how to spend federal funds, and many groups create paraphernalia that can be passed out to share their message. Artifacts on display include a letter from Edith Tinkham to Governor William Harding from 1920, facsimile original in state archives, a poster of Gulf War support from about 1990, and a fan, Iowans for Sensible Priorities in 2004. Another label reads, Before 1892, political parties issued tickets with only one party's candidates, and Iowa men usually voted a straight party ticket. The last election for president with these single-party tickets involved Benjamin Harrison, Republican, and Grover Cleveland, Democrat. Two related artifacts are on display, including a political ticket from the Republican Party 1888 and a punch cup, Democratic President Grover Cleveland, about 1888. Civics in Action. Since our nation's beginning, Americans have debated the meaning and intent of our founding documents and engaged in civic action to ensure and protect the rights of people living in the United States and its citizens living abroad. Each state also has a constitution. Iowa's current state constitution dates to 1857, with earlier versions approved in 1844 and 1846. Understanding the stories of our nation's and state's history and recognizing opportunities for civic engagement is our duty. As you explore these stories, consider the importance of the rights guaranteed in our founding documents. Reflect on how Iowans of various backgrounds have viewed their rights and taken action to ensure equal treatment and opportunity through the laws in the nation and state. living in the United States offers freedom to express individual beliefs, seek change, and show the power of the people. An infographic reads, "The American Republic has three foundational documents: the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776, the Constitution, 1789, and the Bill of Rights, 1791. The national and Iowa state constitutions established three branches of government: the executive branch, which includes the president or governor, the legislative branch, which includes the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the judicial branch, which is the court system." The top image is of Carmen Bernardino pinning a star on World War II service flag, Polk County, 1942. Carmen Bernardino, a native Iowan and daughter of Mexican immigrants, pins a star on a Sons of Aliens service flag at the Polk County Courthouse in honor of her brother Lucas during World War II. The bottom image, Iowa State House, Polk County, about 1900. When the Iowa State House was dedicated in 1884, it was designed to be the location of the Iowa Governor's Office and the meeting place of the Iowa House, the Iowa Senate, and the Iowa Supreme Court, the three branches of Iowa's government. The Iowa Supreme Court moved to the Judicial Branch building in 2003. The Declaration of Independence: Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. The Declaration of Independence is the document that announced that the 13 North American colonies of Great Britain wished to become their own nation. It listed the ways that many in the American colonies felt they were unjustly treated by the British King and Parliament. The Declaration was adopted by the men at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia on July 4, 1776, with the title, quote, "The Unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America," end quote. The conclusion noted the colonies were absolved of, quote, "allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved," end quote. Among the key points for citizens of the new nation were, quote, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights," end quote, and, quote, "that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," end quote. The document was written primarily by Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, with assistance from John Adams of Massachusetts and Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania. Roger Sherman of Connecticut and Robert R. Livingston of New York reviewed it. The drafters and attendees, however, did not believe that these rights applied to everyone living in the 13 colonies that would become the United States. The top image is Benjamin Franklin reviewing the Declaration of Independence, 1931. This print shows an event in 1776 of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who's standing, while Benjamin Franklin reads a draft of the Declaration of Independence. The image is from the Library of Congress. The image on the right is the Declaration of Independence, 1776. Philadelphian John Dunlap printed the first copies of the Declaration of Independence for wide circulation. Image from the Library of Congress. The image on the bottom is surrender of British forces at Yorktown, Virginia, about 1870. On October 19, 1781, major fighting in the American Revolutionary War ended with the surrender of British forces. Major General O'Hara is shown handing his sword to the French commander Comte de Rochambeau, who is standing next to General Washington. Image from the Library of Congress. Celebrating the Declaration. Communities across the United States celebrated Independence Day by the late 1700s. The nation marked the 1876 American Centennial with an exposition in Philadelphia. Among popular items sold at the time were handkerchiefs and engravings. On display is a handkerchief, signers of the Declaration of Independence, 1876. Also on display, commemorative print of the Declaration of Independence, about 1876. Printers created many commemorative prints of the Declaration of Independence for the 100th anniversary of its signing. 56 delegates signed the original. Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, at age 70, was the oldest. The Constitution, the Blessings of Liberty. The Treaty of Paris of 1783 between the American colonies and Great Britain ended the American Revolution and recognized the United States as an independent nation. The United States needed a form of government. Initially, guidelines in the Articles of Confederation were proposed in 1777 in Philadelphia and put into effect in 1781. It created a weak central government, which was a principal cause of its ultimate failure. The transformative document that shapes our nation is the National Constitution, adopted by the 13 colonies in 1788 and in effect since 1789. The preamble highlights its goals and function. Quote, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." End quote. It outlines a form of government with 3 branches, executive, judicial, and legislative, and leaves powers to the states. It also defines and sets the qualifications and terms for federal offices and elections. Several images are on display. At top, Preamble of the U.S. Constitution, 1787. It is believed that Convention delegate Gouverneur Morris of Connecticut wrote the preamble as it had some similarities to his state's preamble. He also led the convention's Committee of Style, image from National Archives. Image of the State House in Philadelphia, 1776, image from 1873. Known today as Independence Hall, the Pennsylvania State House was completed in 1756. Both the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution were debated and signed inside this building. Image from Library of Congress. Another image, title page of the Federalist, New York, 1788. The newspaper essays written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay in 1787 in support of the Constitution, known as the Federalist Papers, were issued in a book form in 1788. Image from the Library of Congress. The image on the bottom is of Roger Sherman, Connecticut, 1911. Roger Sherman signed the Declaration of Independence, but is best known for his work on the U.S. Constitution. He solved a dispute over the legislative branch in 1787 with his proposal for the establishment of 2 legislative bodies. The compromise provided for the House of Representatives with membership based on a state's population, and the Senate with 2 members from each state. Image from the Library of Congress. A graphic on the wall is a poster section of The Signing, the Constitution of the United States, 1937. Illustrator Howard Chandler Christie created a set of posters in honor of the U.S. Constitution's 150th anniversary. A new form of government. Both the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution were approved in the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, today known as Independence Hall. On display is a model of Independence Hall from 1937. George Washington is celebrated as a political and military leader on commemorative items. On display is a poster of the U.S. Constitution from 1937. Alexander Hamilton was the leading advocate of the U.S. Constitution. He wrote 51 of the 85 essays known as the Federalist Papers that appeared in newspapers. On display above the TV screen is a portrait of Alexander Hamilton by C.C. Holden from around 1910. The Bill of Rights. Many attendees of the Constitutional Convention worried that the federal government had too much power in the proposed Constitution. The main compromise to address these concerns was that a group of amendments would be submitted to protect the rights of individuals. 12 amendments were sent to be voted on by white property-owning men. The initial 10 amendments that were ratified by these voters are known as the Bill of Rights. Amending the federal Constitution to include a Bill of Rights was an important compromise in the creation of the United States government. These amendments protected such rights as free speech, the right to assembly, and the right to keep and bear arms. There are 2 images on display. On the right, Proposed Amendments to the Constitution, New York, 1789. Thomas Greenleaf of New York printed a poster on 2 pages, listed together here, to advocate for a Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution. The image on the bottom is Governor William Harding's English-only proclamation, Polk County, 1918. This executive order prohibited the speaking of any language but English in churches, schools, and over the telephone, among other places. It was repealed before it was determined if it was constitutional. The Iowa Constitution. Iowa's Constitution dates to 1857. It was a revision of the 1846 Constitution. It is among the 10 oldest constitutions in the United States. A primary need for the changes was that Iowa's 1846 Constitution banned banks. Like the federal version, Iowa's Constitution created 3 branches of government and defined qualifications and terms for offices and elections. Several images are on display. At top, page 1, Iowa Constitution, Johnson County, 1857. The Iowa Constitution also has a Bill of Rights in its First Amendment that is comprised of 25 sections. The image on the right is Francis Springer, Louisa County, about 1880. Francis Frank Springer was Louisa County's delegate to Iowa's Constitutional Convention in Iowa City in 1857. Before he arrived, the Republican delegates selected him as their candidate for president of the convention. Springer was elected president by 20 Republican votes to 13 Democrat votes. He was a good choice as delegates praised him for his, quote, fairness, impartiality, and unfailing courtesy, end quote. The image on the bottom is of the Iowa Capitol, 1842 to 1846 Territorial Capitol, 1846 to 1857 State Capitol, Johnson County, 2017. Iowa's 1857 Constitution was written when the Capitol and State House were still in Iowa City. You can visit the original state capitol to learn more of Iowa's history. Letter requesting end to black codes, Muscatine County, 1855. Alexander Clark gathered signatures on a petition to repeal Iowa's law that barred black people from coming to Iowa. He later was one of 33 delegates to a convention of African Americans in Muscatine who demanded full citizenship. White men did not support this change, and black men did not get the vote in Iowa until 1868. A dynamic document. The Iowa Constitution was modeled on the U.S. Constitution. It was amended in 1998 to read, quote, all men and women are, by nature, free and equal and have certain inalienable rights, end quote. An artifact on display is a book, The Constitutions of Iowa, by Benjamin F. Shambaugh, 1934. Information Sources Introduction. People have a lot of ways to learn about issues and to engage in civic activities. Conversations with other people have long been a source of gaining and sharing information. Printed works, including pamphlets, posters, cartoons, and newspapers, have also served as important ways to promote causes. Broadcast media, with the radio in the 1920s and television in the 1950s, shared news and opinions locally, regionally, and nationally. By the 1990s, Internet access created a new form of media. Blogs, podcasts, videos, and social media sites have democratized the process of sharing news and commentary. The top image is of workers at the West Union Argo, Fayette County, about 1909. Town newspapers have provided information on local and state issues since the 1830s in the Iowa Territory. The bottom image is of former President Theodore Roosevelt, Plymouth County, 1910. Theodore Roosevelt visited northwest Iowa to campaign for Republicans in early September 1910. He visited Lamar's on September 3rd. Mayfair studio of KMA Radio, Page County, about 1933. KMA Radio was a leader in Iowa radio stations and an important broadcaster in southwest Iowa that employed female and male talent, including Evelyn Birkby. She worked for the station beginning in 1950 through 2019 to the age of 100. Pamphlets and publications. Printed materials come from multiple sources, including magazines, political campaigns, and private organizations. The Iowa State Federation of Labor printed a pamphlet in support of then gubernatorial candidate George Clark, while the Iowa Republican Party printed a pamphlet about his stance on taxation. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, advocated for equality for non-whites beginning in 1909. Representative Dennis Kucinich recognized Iowa's changing population and issued a campaign flyer in Spanish. Cartoonist Ding Darling used Iowa's state motto as the caption for a cartoon criticizing voter apathy that ran in Collier's Weekly magazine in September 1924. On display are multiple artifacts, including a pamphlet, official record on labor topics in 6 legislative sessions from 1912, pamphlet, an address by Governor Clark on taxation in Iowa, 1914, pamphlet, 2 cents a day keeps slavery away, NAACP, 1937, a flyer, Spanish-language campaign literature for Representative Dennis Kucinich, 2004, and a pen and ink drawing, Our Liberties We Prize, by Ding Darling in 1924. Information sources, people. From conversations with friends to attending presentations and rallies, people in the United States have relied on communication with others to gain insight into pressing issues. Des Moines was the site of an alarming anti-war speech by national hero and world-famous pilot Charles Lindbergh on September 11, 1941. In his speech, he expressed anti-Semitism as he identified groups that he believed were trying to push the U.S. into war against Germany. He said, quote, "The 3 most important groups who have been pressing this country toward war are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration." End quote. Harry Truman reignited his successful 1948 presidential campaign with a speech at the National Plowing Championship in Dexter on September 18. He traveled over 25,000 miles, delivering speeches in towns along the rail lines in late September through October. An image on the right, Mabel Smith on the left, and Ava, Benton County, about 1900. Telephones became common in Iowa farm homes by 1910. Historian Tom Moraine noted that the rural towns of Greene County were all connected to Jefferson by 1895. Telephones made communicating between rural neighbors much easier. Another image, Carrie Lane Chapman in wedding dress, Cerro Gordo County, 1884. Within a few years of her first marriage, Carrie Lane Chapman Catt became president of the Charles City Women's Suffrage Club, 1887 to 1888, and secretary and a lecturer with the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association, 1888 to 1890. She later developed and helped lead the successful strategy for the passage of a women's suffrage amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1920. She made bigoted statements to reach this goal. An image on the bottom, Marchers in Support of Better Living Conditions, Polk County, 1969. Members of the Local 450 of the United Auto Workers and Allies marched on the state capitol on March 19, 1969, in support of legislation to protect migrant workers and their families. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa in Des Moines, Larry Day Collection. Information sources, printed materials. Pamphlets, newspapers, and other print media can promote points of view and provoke thought. In the colonial era, Thomas Paine's Common Sense pamphlet increased support across the 13 North American colonies to separate from Great Britain. Newspapers have shared information, urged Iowans to support causes, and attempted to shape opinion since 1836. State and national politicians have produced material to gain support for generations. Posters from various sources have carried patriotic, political, and other messages. Image on the bottom. Almeida, Mark, Ernest and Millie Thomas, Madison County, about 1900. Many Iowans in towns and on farms subscribed to newspapers and magazines to learn about issues and for entertainment. The Thomas family farmed near Earlham. According to census records in 1900, Millie was in high school and Ernest attended college. Ding Darling, October 21st, 1876 to February 12, 1962. His birth name was J. Norwood Darling, but people across the U.S. knew him by his self-given nickname of Ding. A newspaper cartoonist, Darling gained fame in that profession and later through his work in wildlife conservation and art. Darling worked for the Sioux City Journal, the New York Globe, New York Herald Tribune, and Des Moines Register. At one time, most major newspapers had a political cartoonist, and Ding was one of the best, earning 2 Pulitzer Prizes in his career. His cartoons addressed issues of politics, land and wildlife conservation, and other contemporary topics of Iowa and national importance. A dedicated Republican, he served in Franklin Roosevelt's administration. He also worked with Iowa native Aldo Leopold and magazine editor Tom Beck to study the decrease in migratory waterfowl. He became the chief of the U.S. Biological Survey 1934 to 1935 and was one of the leading advocates of the Migratory Bird Hunting Stamp Act. His art, Mallards Dropping In, served as the design of the first federal duck stamp issued in 1934. The sales of these stamps to hunters helped protect habitat for waterfowl. Other migratory birds benefited too. The J.N. Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge on Sanibel Island in Florida was named in his honor. Printed above are 3 cartoons from Ding Darling, one titled The 6-Year Rabbit Hunt, May 16, 1938, the second, Perfect Natural Equipment from July 1937, and third, He Can't Say He Never Got That Letter, December 18, 1926. Ding Darling often criticized President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, the national labor leader from Iowa, John L. Lewis, and politicians in general. He showed FDR as inept and Lewis as a dictator. In the panel to the upper right, farmers are looking to Congress depicted as Santa Claus during a 1926 economic downturn. Information sources, radio and television. KDKA in Pittsburgh transmitted the first scheduled broadcast on November 2, 1920. The station reported returns of the presidential election. Iowa has a noted history of radio stations. In 1922, WOC in Davenport was the first commercial station west of the Mississippi, and public stations in Ames and Iowa City also went on the air that year. WJAM, today WMT, began broadcasting in Cedar Rapids that same year. The Communications Act of 1934 required that broadcast licensees operate in the public interest. In 1962, the Cedar Rapids Jaycees sponsored debates regarding daylight saving time. With the FCC repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, radio stations no longer had to offer equal time to opposing viewpoints. Public interest programs are still broadcast on stations across the state. The image is of Barbara Shope, Polk County, 1939. Carl, Geneva, and Barbara Shope lived in a trailer as Carl was a migrant road builder. Like many Americans, Barbara enjoyed listening to the radio. The family lived in a worker camp north of Des Moines. Sorensen Lamp Company, Polk County, 1928. By the late 1920s, radio sales were common in specialized stores in cities like Des Moines. Cabinet models looked like furniture rather than communication devices. Tabletop radios to smartphones. Since its widespread use in the 1920s, radio transformed communication. National networks and local programming provided news and information. Many Iowa stations employed women to host programs. KMA of Shenandoah had a homemaker program, and their signal reached Iowa, Missouri, and Nebraska. Jessie Young hosted the Stitch and Chat Club beginning in 1926. In 1950, Evelyn Birkby began a career of almost 70 years on KMA. The World Wide Web did not become easily accessible until the creation of the Mosaic browser in 1993. In 2002, BlackBerry manufactured the world's first widely used smartphones. The BlackBerry worked as a phone and had internet access. Iowa Governor Tom Vilsack used this BlackBerry on display in his second term from 2003 to 2007. The iPhone launched in 2006, and Android phones came onto the market in 2008, paving the way for widespread use of smartphones. On display also is a radio Crosley countertop model from about 1950. Television. In 1928, W3XK in the Washington, D.C. area became the first television station in the United States. Iowans had a chance to see early television efforts courtesy of the University of Iowa at the Iowa State Fair in 1931. Television's growth was slow through the 1930s, and World War II stopped its commercial growth. It took off in the late 1940s as stations spread, prices declined, and programming matured. Television stations also must operate in the public interest. Iowa television stations produce local news as well as other programming. Betty Lou Varnum of WOI, then in Ames, was recognized by Women in Radio and Television and McCall's Magazine with a Golden Mike Award for public service reporting in 1964. Varnum's program, Dimension 5, examined various topics including the challenges faced by Iowans with disabilities. Iowa television stations often sponsor candidate debates. Iowa PBS has offered multiple locally produced shows to serve Iowans. An image on display shows a family in living room, possibly Henry County, about 1952. After World War II, many Iowa families owned a single television set and placed it in their front room. It was a status symbol as well as an informational and entertainment device. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa in Iowa City. A.M. Pete Weddick Collection. On the wall is an image of Betty Lou McVeigh, Story County, about 1980. Best known for her children's program, The House with the Magic Window, on then Ames-based WOI TV, Betty Lou McVeigh Varnum also hosted public affairs programming and played other roles for the station during a career that lasted from 1951 to 1994. Drama in real time. Television has played a role in shaping attitudes since the 1950s. The Army McCarthy hearings of April through June 1954 were broadcast on multiple Iowa stations. These hearings shed light on the character of Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin during his efforts to find communists in the armed forces. Massachusetts lawyer Joseph Welch, a Grinnell College graduate from Primgar, represented the Army in some of the testimony. At a June 9, 1954 hearing, Welch shamed McCarthy after an attack on a young lawyer who worked for Welch. Welch replied, quote, "Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness," end quote. When McCarthy tried to reply, Welch angrily finished, quote, "Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You have done enough. Have you no sense of decency?" End quote. Welch's defense of his aide demonstrated the pettiness of Senator McCarthy, and the senator lost much of his credibility. On display is a television and stand, RCA Victor, from about 1960. Digital news. By late 2020, a Pew Research Center survey indicated more than 80% of Americans often or sometimes get their news from digital devices. Sometimes the source could be other media companies, as the study showed that 68% of U.S. adults said they received news often or sometimes from news websites or other apps, while 65% responded that they used search engines like Google. About half, 53%, of the respondents said they obtained news from social media, while 22% answered they received news at least sometimes from podcasts. Iowans can select from many national and local digital sources to get their news. Image, patron at Forest Avenue Library, Polk County, 2023. Iowans have access to information through multiple ways. Public libraries across the state carry print materials, recorded media, and generally offer free Wi-Fi and internet access. Engaging in democracy. Everyone in the United States has the ability to participate in civic activities. Citizens have the greatest responsibilities because they can vote. Anyone born in the United States is considered a citizen. The ability to become a citizen has changed over time. The first Naturalization Act dated to 1790 and said that any free, white adult alien, male or female, who lived in the United States for a period of 2 years was eligible for citizenship. In Iowa, if you are a citizen who claims the state as your primary residence, are over the age of 18, and not a felon, you are eligible to vote. Several images are on display. Vietnam Protest March, Johnson County, 1966. About 250 students from the University of Iowa and other schools held an anti-war rally on November 5, 1966 at the Old Capitol. As they marched through town, they were followed by 100 people challenging their views. The image on the top, Citizenship Ceremony, Polk County, 2019. The Iowa Cubs Baseball Club of Des Moines has hosted citizenship ceremonies close to the 4th of July for several years. Image from the Iowa Cubs, Dylan Hewer. Bottom, Ricky King, Polk County, 2020. Ms. King wanted to encourage civic activity in 2020. She gathered petitions to be placed on the ballot as a presidential candidate and used her role to promote voting. Many people make the U.S. The U.S. Constitution, under Article 1, stated that Congress is to, quote, establish a uniform rule of naturalization, end quote, eventually giving the federal government authority over immigration. The immigration of Asians has been contested for generations. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 forbade immigration and citizenship by Chinese people to the U.S. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1898 in United States v. Wong Kim Ark that any child born in the United States, regardless of race or parent citizenship status, is an American citizen, and the law was repealed in 1943. In the late 1970s, Governor Robert Ray supported the immigration of Southeast Asians to Iowa, especially Hmong people. In World War II, the U.S. government promoted cooperation with the nations of Latin America and the Mexican community located in the United States. Ignacio Lopez, a Californian, designed this poster meaning Americans all, a phrase also used at the end of World War I. On display are several artifacts, including poster Americanos Todos, 1943, sampler made by Anna Clausen in Germany, 1877, and a bag, Hmong textile bag, about 2000. The Iowa Presidential Caucuses. Before 1976, the Iowa Republican and Democratic parties held their presidential caucuses on different dates. In 1972, the Iowa Democratic Party held its initial first-in-the-nation caucuses to place Iowa first along with New Hampshire. In 2024, Iowa Republicans plan to have their caucuses as first in the nation, but the National Democratic Party has sought to change its primary calendar and place South Carolina first in its process. Each party has precinct caucuses, county conventions, and finally, a state convention. The time between the precinct caucuses to state convention was much shorter in the early 1900s. The process often took place over a few weeks. The Iowa caucuses are usually held in January or February, and the respective state conventions are held in June. It is at the state convention where delegates are selected to attend the national party convention. Several images are on display. President Ford at a rally, Polk County, 1975. President Gerald Ford, center, and Governor Robert D. Ray, left, at a political event held at the Shotwell Agency in Des Moines on August 18, 1975. There was a belief that President Ford might select Governor Ray as his running mate in 1976. President Jimmy Carter, Polk County, 1977. After using the Iowa caucuses to launch his successful presidential bid, President Carter returned to Des Moines for an event on October 26, 1977. At about the same time, he supported an effort to knock Iowa from its first-in-the-nation role. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa in Des Moines, David Penny Collection. And at bottom, presidential campaign buttons, 1975 to 1976. The 1976 campaign was the first where the Iowa caucuses were the first presidential tests for the two major parties. Ronald Reagan, Republican, a former governor of California, challenged President Gerald Ford, Republican. Fred Harris, Democrat, was a senator from Oklahoma. Birch Bayh, Democrat, was a senator from Indiana. And Mo Udall, Democrat, was a congressman from Arizona. Jimmy Carter, Democrat of Georgia, would win the 1976 election. Political parties. Party platforms state the basic principles and core stances of a party. A statement in a platform is often called a plank. As public opinion or voting blocks shift, so might a party's platform. In the late 1800s, issues around alcohol, education, and railroad regulation were features of political platforms. Planks on education remain important, as do stances on taxation. State platforms are usually created every 2 years in the off-year election and years with presidential elections. Several images are on display. Prohibition Party platform cover, Polk County, 1936. Newspaper stories emphasize that the Iowa Prohibition Party had candidates for many state offices. The candidate for governor, Ted Fitch of Fort Dodge, advocated for daily Bible study in public schools. Another image, Prohibition Party platform text, Polk County, 1936. The Iowa Prohibition Party regained energy in the 1930s with the repeal of nationwide prohibition and the passing of Iowa liquor laws that provided for the sale of bottled liquor, wine, and spirits from state of Iowa operated stores. At bottom is an image, Republican and Democratic statements on senatorial elections, 1908. Most senators were selected by state legislatures until the 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913. These statements are from a speech by Republican presidential nominee William Taft and the Democratic Party platform. The Populist Party's platform in 1892 called for the direct election of senators, while Oregon became the first state to elect its senators by popular vote in 1908. Political parties in Iowa, 1846 to 1892. Democrats trace their history to Thomas Jefferson and solidified under Andrew Jackson. Among many issues, they favored widespread voting for white men and opposed a national bank. Whigs formed in 1833 as a reaction to the strength of Andrew Jackson as president and sought to defeat his successor Martin Van Buren. Van Buren won in 1836, but the Whigs won the presidency in 1840. Republicans formed when the Whig Party broke up over the issue of slavery in the 1850s. Republicans did not campaign to end slavery in 1856 and 1860, but wanted to end its expansion into all new territories. Greenbacks in the 1870s and populists in the 1890s supported a greater flow of money in what was believed would more equally stimulate the economy. The Prohibition Party of the 1880s and 1890s mainly wanted to ban alcohol from the nation. An infographic, Iowa had 6 important parties in the first 5 decades of statehood. The parties were Whig, Democratic, Republican, Greenback, Prohibition, and Populist or Peoples. Image caption, Political cartoon, The People's Lion, 1892. In this cartoon from a Kansas newspaper, Iowan James B. Weaver is depicted as the defender of the common people as the nominee of the People's Party, commonly called Populists. Populists hope to help the farmers and working people by advocating for fairer prices and wages. Weaver won 22 electoral votes with support from Kansas, Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, North Dakota, and Oregon. Political parties in Iowa, 1896 to 1944. The Socialist Party had gained strength by 1896 and made the Iowa ballot that year. It was not until the 1908 election that Iowa governors would appear on a ballot along with presidential candidates. Iowa's governors were elected in odd years through 1908. When Iowa prohibited alcohol on its own in 1916, the Prohibition Party no longer ran a candidate for governor. On the infographic, it reads, "From 1896 to 1944, two parties remained strong, and at times other parties had candidates running for national and statewide office. The main parties in this era were Republican, Democratic, Prohibition, Socialist, Communist, and Farmer Labor." Image caption, Sample Ticket, Polk County, 1914. The Knights of Luther organized against Catholicism in 1913 and 1914 in Iowa. Otis Spurgeon of Nashua, an opinionated Baptist minister, became a leader. The organization printed religious affiliations on sample ballots, and members gave anti-Catholic speeches. Infighting led to its end by 1920. Image on the bottom left, President Harry Truman, Johnson County, 1948. President Truman made Oxford one of his stops as he began a trip to the national plowing match in Dexter on September 18th. He won the election in November. Political parties in Iowa, 1948 to 2020. By the 1952 presidential election in Iowa, the Democratic and Republican parties were largely dominant. The Prohibition Party returned in the 1930s and continued to nominate candidates for state and national offices. Occasionally, third-party candidates mounted significant campaigns nationally with some effect in Iowa. George Wallace's American independent candidacy in 1968, John Anderson in 1980, and Ross Perot in 1992 and 1996 all had national attention, but did not gain any electoral votes. The Green Party and the Libertarian Party have run candidates for statewide and national office in more recent Iowa elections. The infographic reads, "By the 1952 presidential election in Iowa, the Democratic and Republican parties were largely dominant. The parties are Democratic, Republican, Green Party, and Libertarian." Image caption, Buena Vista County Ballot, 2020. Buena Vista County was the first Iowa county to provide Spanish language on election ballots. It was to comply with federal guidelines that state it must be done when more than 5% of all voting-age citizens have something other than English as their primary language. Image on the bottom right, William Howard Taft campaigning in Cedar Rapids, Lynn County, 1908. Republican presidential candidate William Howard Taft spoke to an estimated crowd of 12,000 on September 26, 1908 in Cedar Rapids. He won the presidency later that year. Electing local, state, and federal officials. In Iowa, the Secretary of State oversees state and federal election activities. Federal elected offices are set in the U.S. Constitution. State offices are defined in the Iowa Constitution. Elections for governor take place in even-numbered years opposite federal elections. Local communities can set the terms of their own elected officials. Iowa did not have an official ballot until 1892. Before that, men went to officials of a political party to get a piece of paper called a ticket. It only had that party's candidates on it. Image caption at bottom, Henry A. Wallace campaigning in Oskaloosa, Mahaska County, 1948. Progressive Party presidential candidate Henry A. Wallace posed with Latino youth during a campaign visit to William Penn College. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa in Des Moines, George S. Mills Jr. collection. Another image, Herbert Hoover visits West Branch, Cedar County, 1928. It is believed this photograph is from Herbert Hoover Day, hosted in West Branch, and at his nearby birthplace on August 21, 1928. Hoover began his Midwestern efforts of a successful presidential campaign in his hometown. He is the only Iowa native elected president. One-party ballots to the blanket ballots. Paper ballots or tickets with only one party were the norm in Iowa elections until 1892. Republican Benjamin Harrison, grandson of President William Henry Harrison, defeated Democrat and sitting President Grover Cleveland in 1888. Cleveland won back the presidency when he defeated Benjamin Harrison in 1892. Several artifacts are on display. A Democratic ticket from 1860, a Republican ticket from 1860, Republican state ticket 1869, Democratic state ticket 1869, Republican state ticket 1871, Democratic state ticket about 1878, Tippecanoe Club about 1888 political ribbon, and Grover Cleveland 1892 political ribbon. First in the Nation and Candidate Appeal. Iowa gained its First in the Nation caucus status in 1972 as part of the Democratic Party reforms following the turmoil of the 1960s. It was an effort to make sure everyday participants had a say in the selection process. In 1976, Republicans joined Iowa Democrats with a First in the Nation caucus with the nomination of President Gerald Ford over Ronald Reagan. Republican Mike Huckabee's campaign and victory of 2008 showed the continued strength of conservative Christians, while Jesse Jackson's 1988 campaign sought to unite rural and urban voters. Several artifacts are on display. Banner, McGovern Shriver, 72 from 1972. Banner, Ford Dole, 1976. Sign, Mike Huckabee, 2008. Banner, Jesse Jackson, 1987, which says, quote, "When we turn to each other and not on each other, and choose the right fight, together we will win." End quote. Jesse L. Jackson, 1988. Campaigns of the Iowa Caucuses. 1980 was a contested caucus on the Democratic and Republican sides. Jimmy Carter energized his 1976 successful presidential campaign with a strong showing in the Iowa caucuses, but he still faced a challenge in 1980 from Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts. The 1980 Republican Iowa caucuses had a strong field, with George H.W. Bush beating Ronald Reagan. Candidates have used various media to share their campaign messages. Several artifacts are on display. Pinback button Jimmy Carter, 1980. Brochure Ted Kennedy, 1980. Pinback button Republican Candidate Forum, 1980. Brochure Iowa Caucus, 1996. VHS tape Lamar Alexander, 1996. VHS tape Howard Dean, 2004. DVD Ron Paul, 2008. DVD Barack Obama, 2008. Voting rights. Voting rights are largely left to individual states in the U.S. Constitution. Iowa's first Constitution of 1846 was created by white men and allowed only white, male, U.S. citizens over the age of 21 who had been in Iowa 6 months prior to an election to vote. It also excluded white men found to be an, quote, idiot or insane, end quote, and those, quote, convicted of any infamous crime, end quote. At times, the Iowa Constitution has been changed to shift voting rights. In 1868, the word white was struck from the document to allow black men to vote. The 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1870 made this a law nationwide. Women could vote in elections on ballot issues, but where a candidate was involved, those defined as electors were men. Efforts to strike the word male from voting qualifications had substantial Iowa supporters by the 1870s, but only achieved a constitutional vote in 1916. It lost, and Iowa did not allow women to vote in elections involving candidates until the federal constitutional change with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Executive. Both Governor Beryl Carroll of Bloomfield and Governor George Clark of Adel supported women's suffrage. It fit their political and personal ideals. Arletta Clark, wife of Governor Clark, wrote an editorial for the Des Moines Register in support of the issue. On May 29, 1916, she participated in a driving tour of Dallas County to promote the cause. Legislative. As moralists within Iowa sought to implement prohibition, they embraced women's suffrage. A Senate joint resolution passed in 1913 and House joint resolution passed in 1915. Representatives Roy Nordyke of Keokuk County, and Peter Clinker of Crawford County, and Senator Joseph Allen of Pocahontas County led the effort in 1915. Judicial. The Iowa Supreme Court did not have involvement in the constitutional change issue of 1916, but ruled in June in a case connected to the city of Des Moines, creating a municipal court. Women voted in that election, and the municipal court bill passed, but opponents challenged the outcome based on women voting. The Iowa Supreme Court ruled the election process was constitutional. The top image, registering to vote, Polk County, 1958. Residents at the Des Moines City Clerk's office registering to vote in the state and county primary election. Image on the bottom, Suffrage Rally, Boone County, 1908. Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, spoke following a parade held during a convention of the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association, October 29, 1908, at Boone. Seeking suffrage and more. Sue M. Wilson Brown was active in the suffrage and civil rights movements. She came to Iowa from Virginia with her family in about 1884. They initially lived in Mahaska County and then came to Des Moines by 1900. She married attorney Samuel Joe S. Joe Brown on December 31, 1902. She was a committed community advocate. In 1907, she published The Iowa Colored Woman. She spoke at the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association meeting in 1919 and then founded the Des Moines League of Colored Women Voters. She also oversaw the purchase of a home for Black students at the University of Iowa in 1919, when dormitories would not admit African Americans. It was home for Black students until university residence halls were desegregated later in the 1940s. Image caption, Women Supporting Voter Equality, Greene County, 1913. Iowa women promoted their desire to vote in elections and community events in the early 1900s. These women in Jefferson and other Iowa women had to wait until 1920. Blanche Schnadig Wolf of Charles City was active in her synagogue and other community activities. In addition to the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association, the Iowa Federation of Women's Clubs advocated for women's suffrage too. Following the passage of the 19th Amendment, Wolf became a leader in the League of Women Voters in Iowa. She served on the committee that planned the Women's Suffrage Memorial in the state capitol. Unfortunately, she died in 1925 prior to its installation and dedication in 1934. Image Blanche Schnadig Wolf, Floyd County, about 1920. Blanche Schnadig Wolf of Charles City also supported better schools and greater social services in Floyd County. She is one of 24 suffragists recognized on a tablet in the Ola Babcock Miller Building, the original historical building. Voting in secret. As single ballots came into use, mechanical voting machines with curtains were developed to ensure privacy, reduce fraud, and modernize voting. Prasong Pak Narak used this machine at the Des Moines restaurant Taste of Thailand to conduct political polls of his customers in the 1980s, 1990s, and the year 2000. On display is a voting machine, American Voting Machine Corps, about 1960. The Prohibition of Alcohol. Protestant reformers in Iowa and their political backers shaped the regulation of alcohol from Iowa's earliest days. In 1880 and 1882, the legislature passed a constitutional amendment on the prohibition of alcohol, which the male voters of Iowa supported in 1882, thus making Iowa constitutionally a dry state. The Iowa Supreme Court ruled the amendment unconstitutional in 1883. In 1894, a local option law went into effect. It was repealed in 1916. Iowa passed the federal Prohibition Amendment in January 1919, and many Iowans supported national prohibition even after its repeal in 1933. The state of Iowa still controls the sale of hard liquor. Executive. Two different Iowa governors, Governor John Henry Geer and Governor Buren R. Sherman, supported the change to the Iowa Constitution. Governor Sherman was in office in 1882 when the change took effect. Legislative. Both the 18th General Assembly, 1880, and the 19th General Assembly, 1882, passed an Iowa constitutional amendment banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol. The male voters of Iowa approved the amendment on June 27, 1882, with 155,436, or 55.29%, voting in favor of it. 125,677, or 44.71% of men voted against it. Judicial. Kohler and Lang Brewery in Davenport challenged the constitutional change. The Iowa Supreme Court heard the case of Kohler and Lang v. Hill and issued a ruling on April 21, 1883. The opinion found the amendment unconstitutional based on text differences between the amendments passed in the Iowa legislature. Because the language was slightly different in the two different legislative sessions, the change was invalid. Image caption at top: Raid on moonshining operation, Johnson County, about 1922. Law enforcement officials breaking up a liquor still early in the national Prohibition era. Iowa had a law barring the sale of alcohol dating to 1916, but dozens of illegal operations across the state produced alcohol. Another image: Iowa State Fairgrounds, Polk County, about 1911. The Woman's Christian Temperance Union and Iowa Women's Suffrage Association maintained offices on the main concourse on Grand Avenue. Image at bottom: Drinking beer at Crandall's Point, Dickinson County, about 1890. Vacation spots often allowed greater freedom in pushing social norms. Women might feel more free to consume alcohol when away from home. Image panel: Board of Trustees of the Iowa Women's Christian Temperance Union, Polk County, 1894. The Women's Christian Temperance Union gave women a chance to participate in civic activities in Iowa when they could not vote in candidate elections. An alliance between temperance and suffrage leaders promoted women getting the vote, as many believed it would lead to a ban on alcohol. A schoolhouse on every hilltop and no saloon in the valley. Even though the constitutional prohibition of alcohol failed at the Iowa Supreme Court, the Iowa Republican Party continued to follow the campaign slogan of, quote, "a schoolhouse on every hilltop and no saloon in the valley," end quote, which Lieutenant Governor Orlando Manning proclaimed in 1883. It served the Republican Party well into the early 1900s. Image caption: Image of Floral Schoolhouse, Polk County, 1883. Cabinet card photo showing a floral schoolhouse presented to Iowa Lieutenant Governor O.H. Manning by the Women's Christian Temperance Union in observance of Manning's quote, "a schoolhouse on every hilltop and no saloon in the valley," end quote. The power of local option. Iowa Democrats supported a policy of letting communities decide on alcohol policy. Many larger cities and some towns, especially those with a Catholic population, supported this local option. Horace Boyce, a one-time Republican politician, switched to the Democratic Party over this issue. He won the governor's race in 1889 and 1891. He was the only Democrat to hold the governorship in Iowa from 1854 to 1933. Prohibition or local control. The prominence and political leadership of Protestant reformers who saw alcohol as a corruptive influence shaped the nation's civic culture by the early 1800s. Temperance societies were organized in Iowa by the mid-1840s. Publications with lessons on temperance were common. Women in clubs and organizations, including the Women's Christian Temperance Union, promoted the prohibition of alcohol. Manufacturers, including the Duffy Malt Whiskey Co., advertised the supposed health benefits of their beverages in Iowa newspapers. Often these ads contained fake experts. When national prohibition was in effect from 1921 to 1933, some Iowans produced their own alcohol at home. This still was used in Clinton County. There are several artifacts on display. Pamphlet, National Temperance Almanac for 1870, from 1870. Program 17th Annual Session of the Iowa Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, 1918. Box Bank, Women's Christian Temperance Union of Iowa, about 1930. Bottle, Duffy Malt Whiskey Co., about 1895. And Homemade Still, about 1925. Equality and Equal Rights. Iowa had passed a Civil Rights Act in 1884, but it was not always enforced. Black people were regularly denied service at locations across the state into the 1960s. In July 1948, Edna Griffin, John Bibbs, and Leonard Hudson, all of Des Moines, sought counter service at the Katz Drug Store, located at the corner of Locust and 7th Streets. They were denied service and filed a lawsuit and also marched with signs at the store. The Iowa Supreme Court ruled in their favor in 1949, ending overt discrimination at this store. Executive. No record of statements connected to the Katz Drug Store discrimination case can be found for Iowa's candidates for governor in 1948. However, Griffin and Bibbs were both challenged to name their political affiliation in the Des Moines court case in October 1948. They both felt it was private information and protested, but ultimately testified that they supported Iowan and former Vice President Henry A. Wallace. He was running as a third-party candidate for president and advocated for racial equality with a platform that condemned, quote, segregation and discrimination in all its forms, end quote. Legislative. The Iowa legislature had written the 1884 Civil Rights Act, but serious enforcement only began in the late 1940s. In 1953, the legislature also began holding hearings on discrimination in employment. A 1965 Iowa bill would strengthen civil rights enforcement in Iowa with the creation of specific language on civil rights and the Iowa Civil Rights Commission. The commission could investigate and penalize those found in violation of the law. Judicial. The Polk County Attorney's Office prosecuted the Katz Drug Store for misdemeanor criminal charges under the 1884 Iowa Civil Rights Act. The store and manager were found guilty by a jury of 6 white women and fined $50. The store appealed the conviction to the Iowa Supreme Court. In December 1949, the Iowa Supreme Court issued its decision upholding the conviction of the store for violating the civil rights of Edna Griffin, John Bibbs, and Leonard Hudson. Image on the top, Edna Griffin, Polk County, 1977. Edna Griffin supported civil rights causes across the state. She sought to assist on a case in Sioux City at the same time she was fighting against Katz Drug Store. Another image, Flynn Griffin Building, Polk County, about 1970. The building that housed Katz Drugs was built in 1885 for the offices of Irish immigrant Martin Flynn. He and his wife Ellen had a livestock farm in western Polk County. Because of its association with him and the civil rights efforts of Edna Griffin and others, it is known as the Flynn Griffin Building. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. Image at the bottom, steamship Philip Sheridan of the Northwestern Union Packet Co., Upper Mississippi River, about 1870, reprint. Illinois resident Emma Koger gained a degree of equality for Black people in Iowa when she sued the Northwestern Union Packet Co. in 1872. She was denied dining privileges in the main cabin on their ship, the Merrill. She won her lawsuit, which the Iowa Supreme Court upheld in September 1873. Her victory made it illegal to discriminate against Black people on steamboats in Iowa. Mural graphic, Protest at Waterloo East High School, Black Hawk County, 1969. Students protested on March 3, 1969, over reports that a school counselor objected to a white female student dating a Black male student and reported the relationship to the young woman's parents. The allegation was never proven. Discrimination at the Surf Ballroom. On December 8, 1951, LaFawn Amos, her husband, and a group of friends went to see jazz musician Lionel Hampton perform at the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake. When the group arrived, they were denied admission because they were Black. Ms. Amos sued the management company for damages of $10,000. The case went to the U.S. District Court, which ruled in her favor on January 11, 1954. She was granted compensation of $400 by an all-white jury of 5 women and 7 men. The case was one of the last major civil rights cases in Iowa based on race. Image caption, newspaper advertisement, Franklin County, 1951. The Surf Ballroom advertised the Lionel Hampton concert in newspapers outside Cerro Gordo County. Ads appeared in the Hampton Chronicle and the Kossuth County Advance. Accommodation for Black travelers. In March 1953, Evelyn and Cecil Reed of Cedar Rapids opened the Sepia Motel along U.S. Highway 30 east of the city. Black people traveling across the United States often had trouble finding lodging. The hotel would eventually be listed in the Negro Motorist Green Book. The Reeds were inspired by worries about finding lodging as they had traveled to Denver. They wanted Black people traveling on Highway 30 to know they would be welcome, and using the word sepia, meaning brown color, served as assurance that any traveler was welcome there. Image caption, Evelyn and Cecil Reed, Lynn County, about 1964. Cecil Reed operated a successful floor finishing business in Cedar Rapids in the 1950s and into the 1960s. He won a seat in the Iowa House as the first Black Republican in that body. American Indian Rights. In July 1971, Maria Running Moccasins Pearson went to the Iowa Capitol to visit with Governor Robert Ray after native remains from a cemetery near Glenwood had been sent to the Office of the State Archaeologist, OSA, earlier that year. Pearson's husband, who worked for the Iowa Highway Commission and knew of the project, reported that remains of white people were reburied, but those of a native woman were sent to the OSA for study. Pearson was from the Yankton Sioux Nation and believed native remains should also be reburied. Her activity set in motion a revised statute on human remains that passed the Iowa legislature in 1976. Executive. Governor Robert D. Ray supported equal treatment for Iowans in life and death, including for people who lived and died in the land we now call Iowa. He directed the curator of the State Museum to remove native human remains from display in 1972. He supported and signed the 1976 legislation to clarify the legality of unearthing native remains in Iowa. Legislative. The Iowa legislature debated the cultural interest of native peoples with a perceived scientific value over human remains for 4 years. In 1976, a revised statute was passed making it a crime in Iowa to, quote, dig up ancient remains without notifying the state archaeologist, end quote. Judicial. Before 1976, it took a court order to rebury native remains in Iowa. Iowa courts and the Iowa Supreme Court rarely had to intervene in such matters. When Maria Pearson raised concerns over the unequal treatment of remains near Glenwood in 1971, Marshall McCusick, the state archaeologist, stated it would take a court order to compel him to return the Native American remains. After determining that the remains were from the 1840s and part of an early cemetery, McCusick avoided a lawsuit and agreed to Pearson's request that the remains be reburied at a Glenwood cemetery. Top image, Maria Pearson and Governor Robert Ray, Polk County, 1981. Maria Pearson served on the state's first Indian Advisory Committee and provided valuable guidance to Governor Ray and Governor Branstad. Bottom image, backhoe disturbing a native village site, Polk County, 1963. In 1963, in West Des Moines, artifacts and human remains were uncovered during a building project. Fred Waddell of the Iowa State Historical Department monitored the activity to prevent damage to significant materials. The American Indian Movement. Quote, when a man dies, he should be buried and left in peace, end quote. These were the sentiments of Harvey Major, a man with Ojibwe ancestry and acting president of the Des Moines chapter of the American Indian Movement, or AIM, in 1972. George Mitchell, Dennis Banks, and Clyde Belcourt of Minnesota founded the national organization in the summer of 1968 to fight discrimination against people with Native ancestry. Major advocated that all human remains be treated with dignity at a time when American Indians' remains were still part of many museum displays. Some were still on display 50 years ago at the State Historical Museum in its former location at 1112 East Grand Avenue. The local chapter of AIM sought to end the exhibition of the remains of 5 Native people, including a woman and an infant. Major and others from AIM went to Governor Ray with their concerns. Ray listened to multiple perspectives, then stated that, quote, "What is highly educational to some is offensive to others," end quote. He acknowledged museum curator Jack Musgrove for his preservation and exhibition efforts, but recognized the spiritual and human rights concerns raised by members of AIM. Ray eventually requested the removal of the display and called for further study of the options. Excerpt of document mailed to Governor Robert Ray, Polk County, 1974, image caption. The American Indian Movement held a conference on April 15 through 16, 1974, in Des Moines. Among the materials sent to Governor Ray was a booklet discussing issues of concerns to members of the American Indian Movement and proposed resolutions. The Meskwaki Settlement. The Meskwaki Nation of Tama County is one of 753 sovereign tribal nations in the United States. The U.S. Constitution recognizes that tribal nations are sovereign governments, just like Mexico, Canada, or France. Sovereignty is a legal word meaning the authority to self-govern. The Meskwaki were forced to sell their land and pressured to leave Iowa through a treaty in 1842. In spite of persistent federal efforts to push the Meskwaki out of Iowa, many members resisted, and they eventually purchased 80 acres of land in Tama County in 1857. They own more than 8,000 acres today. Traditions of artistry. People from Native nations have always used decoration to express cultural traditions and beliefs. In its earlier years, the State Historical Museum did not always make an effort to recognize the people who created the items in the collection. The donor of the Meskwaki bracelet recorded that it was made by noted Meskwaki metalsmith Bill Leaf. He helped preserve Meskwaki stories too. 3 artifacts are on display, including a moccasin, South Dakota, about 1955, watch fob, U.S. Great Lakes, about 1920, and a bracelet from the Meskwaki settlement, about 1940. Constitutional changes of 1968. In the early 1960s, there was an effort to transform aspects of Iowa's constitution. Republicans and Democrats came together to draft a set of constitutional amendments that, among other changes, instituted annual legislative sessions, allowed municipalities to pass expenditures without state authorization, and provided the governor a line-item veto. At the time, Iowa was one of only 8 states that did not give their governor this power. A line-item veto allows a governor to veto individual items in an appropriations bill. Otherwise, the governor had to accept or reject an entire spending bill. This gave the governor power to reject appropriations she or he did not approve. Executive. In 1968, both major candidates for Iowa governor, Republican Robert Ray and Democrat Paul Franzenberg, supported the line-item veto. Legislative. When the bill to authorize a constitutional amendment came before the Iowa legislature in 1967 for its second passage by a consecutive General Assembly, it passed the Iowa Senate 50-9, with 1 Democrat and 8 Republicans opposing it. It passed in the Iowa House on March 8th by a vote of 66-55. The House voted to reconsider it on March 28th, but it passed again. Judicial. The validity of the line-item veto was challenged, and on April 9, 1971, the Iowa Supreme Court ruled in favor of Governor Ray's use of it on an issue related to moving highway engineers' offices. Governor Ray had vetoed the funds, and the Iowa Highway Commission attempted to make the move anyway. The ruling set a precedent that the line-item veto was constitutional. The top image is Iowa Senate Chamber, Polk County, about 1890. Until the 1968 Iowa constitutional change, the Iowa Senate and Iowa House met every other year. It was argued an annual session would provide better budgeting. Another image, political advertisement, Woodbury County, 1968. Iowans for a Better Government placed advertisements in newspapers across the state. It reflected support from people of influence, both locally and from across the state. Bottom, Voting Panel of Iowa House, Polk County, 1961. The constitutional change of 1968 reduced the number of Iowa House members from 108 to 100. Statesman and short-term governor. Robert D. Fulton of Waterloo served in the Iowa House and the Iowa Senate, plus 4 years as lieutenant governor and 16 days as governor in 1969. He was the Democrat who served as a co-chair of the Iowans for a Better Government Committee. Fulton did not seek office in 1968, but took over from Governor Harold Hughes, who joined the U.S. Senate on January 1, 1969, until Robert Ray was inaugurated on January 16th of that year. A college professor for a better Iowa. William G. Murray of Cedar Rapids became a professor at Iowa State College in 1927. He was a nationally recognized agricultural economist and the Republican nomination for governor in 1958 and 1966. His respect as a leader in the Iowa Republican Party made him a logical choice to co-chair the effort to change the Iowa Constitution in 1968 through the Iowans for a Better Government Committee. He continued to teach at Iowa State into the 1980s, but also created Living History Farms in Urbandale, a noted outdoor history museum. The top image, Robert Fulton, Polk County, about 1967. William Murray left, and Governor Robert Ray, Polk County, 1979. Lieutenant Governor Robert Fulton was re-elected in 1966 by 1,260 votes, a narrow victory considering Governor Harold Hughes won by more than 99,000 votes. After Living History Farms hosted Pope John Paul II in October 1979, later that year, William Murray and others presented a commemorative book to Governor Ray. Bipartisan transformation. In spite of different governing ideas, politicians from the Republican and Democratic parties came together to support changes to the Iowa Constitution in 1968. Several buttons and a sticker are on display. I'm working for Bill Murray for governor, 1958 button. Robert D. Fulton, the mini inaugural, 1969 button. Hughes, Democrat for governor, about 1962 button. I like Bob Ray for governor, 1968 button. Franzenberg governor, 1972 button. And a bumper sticker, Stanley for U.S. Senator, 1968. Iowans of Action, John and Mary Beth Tinker. Brother and sister John and Mary Beth Tinker took their student free speech efforts to the U.S. Supreme Court. They, along with some of their classmates, wanted to show support for a ceasefire in the Vietnam War at Christmas that had been called for by Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York in 1965. They created black armbands to wear at school. The Des Moines School Board viewed their activities as disruptive to the school environment. The case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and while limits were imposed, the Tinkers won the case in 1969. Justice Hugo Black wrote that the students did not, quote, shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate, end quote. Commemorating youth activism. John Tinker and Mary Beth Tinker continue to share their story of promoting First Amendment rights. They participated in an educational program at the State Historical Building of Iowa in 2019. On display is an armband with a peace symbol from 2019. Also a poster celebrating Youth Voices 2019. Iowans of Action, Smith Brookhart. A number of Iowans have served in leadership of the National Rifle Association. U.S. Senator Smith Brookhart of Bloomfield served as its president from 1921 to 1926, with a short break from his presidential role in the last 2 years of his service. Brookhart had gained notoriety in the group for his service as a highly skilled shooter in World War I. At the time, Brookhart advocated for skill and training. Today, the group emphasizes safety as well as other rights connected to firearms and the Second Amendment. Iowans of Action, Jean Adeline Morgan Wanatee. Jean Adeline Wanatee was an artist and advocate of American Indian and women's rights. Known as Adeline, she attended the Sac and Fox Day School on the Meskwaki settlement until 1923, when she was sent to the government boarding school in Flandreau, South Dakota. She soon returned to the settlement to finish her schooling. Then in 1931, she graduated from the Haskell Institute in Lawrence, Kansas. On February 7, 1932, she married Frank David Wanatee. She believed that American Indian children should be educated in local public schools under tribal control. She worked for the preservation of Indian culture by speaking and teaching the Meskwaki language and creating and teaching Meskwaki arts. She was instrumental in the creation of the Meskwaki Primary, an elementary school text of the Meskwaki language, a language textbook. She was the first woman elected to the Meskwaki Tribal Council. She also served as a specialist and resource person for the Smithsonian Institution and was the first American Indian to be inducted to the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame. Iowans of Action, Gertrude Rush. Gertrude Rush of Des Moines was Iowa's first Black woman lawyer. She and other lawyers from Iowa helped found the National Bar Association in 1925 when Black lawyers could not join the American Bar Association. They provided legal counsel for Black people in Iowa when it was difficult for them to get a lawyer. She sometimes served as a parole officer for her clients who received suspended sentences. Ms. Rush worked to make sure all were treated equally in Iowa. Iowans of Action, Jessie Shambaugh. Jessie Field graduated from Tabor College in 1903 and began teaching at Goldenrod School in the Fremont Township, Page County. There she organized the boys and girls clubs that became the models for the 4-H club movement in the United States. The rural schools of Page County were regarded as among the best in the nation under her leadership. She even co-wrote a book in 1916 titled Community Civics on the role of schools in creating good citizens. She would later help her brother Henry with his radio station KFNF in the 1930s. Today, she is regarded as a founder of the 4-H movement. Iowans of Action, Carolyn Pendray. Born in Mount Pleasant, Carolyn Pendray lived in Maquoketa when she became the first woman elected to the Iowa legislature in 1928, 2 years after women were made eligible by a change to the Iowa Constitution. She served 2 terms in the Iowa House and 1 in the Iowa Senate. She co-sponsored a bill permitting a wife to hold certain property of her own, exempt from seizure or debt. Prior to this law, only the husband was recognized as head of a household, and only he could claim property exempt from seizure for debt. Iowans of Action, Grenville Dodge. Grenville Dodge came to Council Bluffs in 1854. He worked as a railroad surveyor before and after the Civil War. During the war, he often worked in making sure railroad supply lines remained open. He was promoted to Major General and fought at the Battle of Atlanta in 1864, where he received a head wound. He had met Abraham Lincoln in Council Bluffs in 1859, and that meeting shaped U.S. history. After the war, Dodge was the Eastern engineer for the Union Pacific's Transcontinental Railroad. Iowans of Action, Henry Hospers. Henry Hospers was mayor of Pella in Marion County when he and about 75 families acquired land in Sioux County to establish Orange City in 1870. Hospers promoted Dutch settlement in northwest Iowa by accepting an appointment to the Netherlands for the Iowa State Board of Immigration. He opened a recruiting office and advertised in newspapers in 6 cities to encourage emigration. He distributed copies of an official state brochure titled Iowa, the Home for Immigrants, as well as his own booklet, Iowa, Shall I Emigrate to America? He returned to Iowa and operated newspapers, was a founder of what became Northwestern College, and served as head of the County Board of Supervisors for 15 years. He also served 2 terms in the Iowa House and 1 term on the Iowa Senate. Iowans of Action, Mia Peterson. Mia Peterson grew up in Webster City and was a national advocate for people with disabilities. She spoke to lawmakers about how legislation affected her life. In 2000, she testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions on the impact of the Americans with Disabilities Act, originally passed in 1990, with Senate sponsorship of Senator Tom Harkin. She gave personal testimony for the Kennedy-Brownback proposed legislation on healthcare provider education for counseling families regarding prenatal screening and diagnoses. Mia often said, quote, "Let people with disabilities speak for themselves, and don't let others speak for them," end quote. She always wanted to be her own spokeswoman and encouraged everyone to make their voices heard. A tireless trailblazer. Mia Peterson always sought ways to be engaged in activities and be a leader. She ran cross-country in high school and participated in plays and speech competitions. She moved to Cincinnati, Ohio in 1997. While there, she served as an Olympic torchbearer in December 2001 for the 2002 Olympic Winter Games in Salt Lake City. On display is Mia Peterson's high school jacket from Webster City High School about 1991, on loan courtesy of the Peterson family. Also on display is the Olympic torch from the Olympic Winter Games 2001. What can you do? It's the responsibility for all of us to exercise our power living in a democratic republic. Iowans can participate in government in multiple ways, from civil protest to serving in government. As John and Mary Beth Tinker showed in their free speech case at the U.S. Supreme Court, high school and middle school students can change the interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. There are many ways to make a difference in your community in Iowa and beyond. The top image, workers at meatpacking plant, Cerro Gordo County, about 1955. In the 1950s, many workers at meatpacking plants joined unions to gain better wages and benefits, and additional protections in the workplace. Voting is Your Right poster, Polk County, 2023. The Iowa Secretary of State creates materials to help voters understand their legal protections in voting. Image bottom, International Women's Year display, Jasper County, 1975. Ruth Van Note, second from left, was a member of the Governor's Committee on the United Nations for International Women's Year. Information centers were placed in 24 Iowa communities, including Newton. Social action and art. Political cartoons, war-era posters, and protest signs are ways people have visually represented their beliefs. It is a creative way to show your civic virtues and values. These unique or mass-produced materials can mobilize people around a cause. Look for creative ways to promote civic action through a visual means. Image caption, top, from left to right. Images of World War II posters. Plowshares Are Swords, 1943. Schools at War, 1942. Starve the Squander Bug, 1943. During World War II, people of all ages were encouraged to support the war effort. Theodore Geisel, best known as Dr. Seuss, drew characters promoting thrift that were similar to those he drew for many of his later books. Advocacy and art. The symbol of a rattlesnake with the text "Don't Tread on Me" dates to the eve of the American Revolution in 1776. This iconic symbol is now used by many groups promoting their cause. Iowan and Academy Award-winning actor Donna Reed was a founder of the group Another Mother for Peace. They sold cards and posters with the phrase, quote, "War is not healthy for children and other living things," end quote, in the Vietnam War era. On display are bumper stickers from the National Rifle Association 2015 and a poster which reads "War is not healthy" from 1970. Write a letter. You can express your views in many ways. While an email is an easy response, writing a letter almost always has more impact. Take time to organize your thoughts, but it is also important to be timely. Have a friend who is a good writer review a draft. A well-written 1- or 2-page letter lets you share your beliefs on an issue and may help others look at it from another perspective. Image caption, Postcard to Governor Terry Branstad, Dubuque County, 1985. Tim Patterson of Dubuque sent this postcard to Governor Branstad writing, quote, "These pigs are depressed because of the farm economy. What can you and I together do about it?" End quote. Vote. Among the basic rights people in the U.S. prize is voting. Once you reach voting age, you can participate in local, state, and national elections. Follow the issues and research candidates to determine those who you feel most align with your values. Elected leaders and their staff appreciate hearing from everyone, but especially voters. Image caption, sample of Iowa voter registration form, Polk County, 2023. Iowa has a voter identification law requiring a photo ID be shown at the time of voting. Voters may show an Iowa driver's license or non-operator ID, U.S. passport, U.S. military ID or veterans ID, tribal ID or document, or Iowa voter ID card. Second image, Kathy Montgomery voting in Forest City, Winnebago County, 2022. Precinct workers John Lund and Kim Mollenhauer assist Kathy Montgomery in voting at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Forest City. Image from Rob Hillisland, Mason City Globe Gazette, Forest City Summit Tribune. Be active in your community. When you see something that you believe is an injustice, look for a way to make it more just. Find ways to express your beliefs and how you can help Iowa and the nation live up to our founding ideals. Put your civic and personal values into action and make your voice heard. Image caption at top, Sarah Young Bear Brown on left and Mary Young Bear, Polk County, 2019. In November 2019, Sarah Young Bear Brown and Mary Young Bear of the Meskwaki Nation attended the installation ceremony of a Native Nations flag display in the state capitol. Image from the Iowa Department of Human Rights. Bottom image, staff meeting at Freedom House, Coahoma County, Mississippi, 1964. Des Moines minister Fraser Thomason took this photograph as he helped train and register voters in the summer of 1964. He and his wife Loris traveled to Clarksdale to assist Black people as many sought to vote for the first time.